Hi, I'm Suzi Dafnis of the Australian Businesswomen's Network. My guest today is Catherine Fox, Deputy Editor of the Financial Review's Boss magazine and writer for the paper's weekly column, Corporate Woman. She's an author, a regular speaker at seminars and an advocate for the advancement of women in business. Catherine, welcome to In Her Shoes.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
As I mentioned in the introduction, you're a writer, you're a journalist, you're an author. You often speak, though, publicly on behalf of women in business, championing women's issues. What drives the passion to do that?
Look, I suppose overall it might go back to my family background. I think might have quite a lot to do with it. But I think it's also a combination of what I've observed over many years. And I clearly have an allergy to unfairness. I find that very, very annoying. And I think what also happened, because, you know, I did well at school and went to university and I was a good girl. I did everything I was told, and it came as quite a surprise to me to understand what was happening in the workplace, where being intelligent and applying yourself was simply not enough. And I think what really politicised me around women in work was when I had my own children. And so I think it's a combination of always, you know, your background I think plays a huge part, and certainly my mother and father brought me up to think that everybody was equal, and that was a very important foundation and a very strong social justice agenda. But I think since then it's my personal experiences that have made me feel very frustrated. And because I'm a writer and I have a great job because I'm able to use my writing as a platform for something I care passionately about, I've been very fortunate to be able to combine a personal interest with my professional life.
Let me ask you quickly, you mentioned that having children amplified, I guess, the need for you to speak out. Why?
Well, it really, I suppose, shouldn't have been as much of a shock to me, but it genuinely was, to find that when I returned to work after having my first child, I felt in a sense that I'd almost disappeared. And I found that really odd. And I'm not suggesting for one moment that this is done particularly consciously, or indeed with sort of evil intent. But I think workplaces tend to make a lot of assumptions about mothers. And I found myself, even though I returned to full-time work after my first daughter was born, I just didn't feel as though I was being included in the same way. I felt I was being seen in a different light, so that even though I knew I was the same person and brought the same skills to the workplace, I simply felt that in a way I'd been sort of put on a sideline. It wasn't overt, I have to say, but I really did feel that. And I, of course, have a lot of female friends, and I realised that many of them were going through the same thing.
And one of the things you've done, which I want to talk about today, is that you've identified 7 career myths. Now, these are myths that, in a way, justify why it is that there aren't more women advancing in their careers or more women in leadership positions. So let's do some myth busting and have a look at each of these. So the first one I want to look at is work hard and you will be rewarded.
Yes, I think I've probably just mentioned that I was very much brought up to believe that, and I think we still expect that of our young women. Work hard, put your head down, study hard, and you will be rewarded. And to a large extent in the education sphere, that's exactly what happens. I think when you get into the workplace, a whole lot of other things come into play. They're not particularly transparent. So I think it's about working out, in fact, how you do get ahead in a structure that was designed and is benefiting one gender much more than another. Now that's historical, again, but I think we have to understand that there are subtleties that are not obvious, and they're all about how you climb the ladder, how you become noticed. I wouldn't say for a moment that you don't have to perform well. I think it's very important that we understand performing well and delivering is of course a given, but I think there's a whole lot of other aspects that are not easy to suss out. And for women, often enough, they're shut out of some sort of inner sanctum that, or networking that just happens almost by default for men, and simply is much, much more difficult for women.
So there's a lot more than just being good at your job.
There is a lot more, but I think the myth there is around the fact that we still tell each other, and I think a lot of women believe this too, that a workplace surely is a meritocracy. So no matter what happens or what your gender is or any other factor, that as long as you have merit, it will be rewarded. And I guess my message here, especially to women starting out in their careers, is you will hear this a lot. It is classic corporate rhetoric. This is a meritocracy. I'm afraid it's not true. And we have to unpack that because our businesses are suffering from that too.
One of the areas of unfairness which we see is the difference in pay for men and women. So the second myth I want to look at is that it's a myth that the gender gap is grossly exaggerated.
That's
is it
right.
grossly exaggerated?
I think it's a myth to say that it's grossly exaggerated. And the reason I say that is I hear that a lot. And I hear it from men, but I hear it from women too. And again, I think it's our sense of justice, ironically, that is being completely outraged. We just can't believe that our workplaces would have this gap. Now, remembering also that the statistics around gender pay gap are calibrated on a comparison of average hourly earnings for the same work. So it doesn't take into account part-time. There are a lot of people who say very odd and misleading things about the gender pay gap. The data is pretty robust and very consistent. So in this country, we have an 18% gender pay gap between men and women's average hourly earnings. And in certain business sectors, it's much broader than that. So financial services, for example, it's 28%. And that is attributed to a number of causes. One of them is discrimination on the basis of gender. We do also have a very high level in this country of job segregation. So women tend to be clustered in certain occupations which are usually lower paid positions. So there are a lot of factors. It's quite complex. But the gender pay gap, if anything, is not exaggerated. I don't think it gets the attention that it should.
And it actually starts quite early in someone's career.
It does indeed. In fact, we now know, because there's a great deal of research now around this, that the gender pay gap starts a year after graduation. So 1 year only in the workforce. And I did read some details the other day, also made research from Australia, which found that, in fact, it can start even from day one, i.e. some male graduates are put on at a higher level than their female peers. So it's very disturbing, but look, it is disturbing, but we need to pay attention to it to resolve it.
The third myth I want to look at is women choosing to have children and therefore leaving the work environment for a period of time, and the myth that they lose sight of a career path or they lose interest in being career women.
Yeah, I guess the myth here is really about that ambition, that sort of career focus, I think. I know because I've brought up 3 small children, and it's a time of your life when indeed your focus can shift. However, I didn't have a lobotomy when I had my children, and I still wanted to have a satisfying job as well and work life. And I guess my point here is, again, I think we make lots of assumptions on behalf of mothers in the workforce, and I don't think we should do that. It's dangerous. I should also point out that for many women, this is not a choice. Having a job is simply mandatory. They need the income. So the danger here, of course, is that the assumptions can lead to some really retrograde sort of systemic problems for women in the workplace. Needless to say, because for some women, quite a few in fact, they do have to opt for part-time work. And when I say have to, I think choice, we have to be very careful about using the word choice there. If they're not the primary breadwinner in a relationship, then really the choice is not there. The husband has to continue working full-time, even if he would countenance a part-time role. So it is the woman who typically decides they will go the part-time route. And that's very tricky, but it doesn't mean the end of a career. It doesn't mean a door slams shut. I always say to women, please do consider very carefully whether you detach permanently from the workplace. It's very hard to reattach. Right. It also has implications, of course, for superannuation and retirement savings and a whole lot of other issues. So, I mean, when we look at careers, they are sort of 45 years, so the time out of the workplace, which I think is another myth, it's on average less than 2 years for most women. It's not a huge percentage when you think about an entire career. So I think we have to be very careful to pull apart some of the mythology and assumptions around what happens to a mother in the workforce. Can I just add, there's some amazing studies around this, particularly out of the US, about something called the motherhood penalty. And there's an academic at Stanford who's done a wonderful study where she gave CVs with exactly the same details and background to a number of people and asked them to review these candidates and see if they were appropriate to take on. The only thing she changed was gender and whether they had children or not. And guess what? The mothers applying for jobs were ranked as less appropriate. They were considered less deserving of higher salary, for promotion, and so on. And it's one of many studies that shows that while we like to think of ourselves as being bias-free,
Yes.
it's quite the opposite. So there are a whole lot of assumptions there. And in Australia, the other assumption I think is often made is that a good mother is one who stays at home.
Wow. Okay. Just before we wrap up on that point, these are smart people making these decisions. These are accomplished, educated people looking at resumes and choosing to, on a nonsensical basis, dismiss someone from an opportunity. I don't understand.
Have you heard of something called subconscious bias?
I
There is
don't
a
think I have.
psychological term, subconscious bias, and it's very common. And it's something that's so deeply embedded, it is indeed subconscious. We don't even know we're doing it. And we have it as well. We all have it. It all comes to bear when we look at things like gender, race, and a whole lot of other factors. So again, I wouldn't suggest for a moment that people are doing this deliberately. But when we look at all the academic research and the studies that we have, and there are many of them around now, it's quite, it all says the same thing to us, that in fact the way our brain works is often something we don't even understand. The other book that I'm particularly fond of at the moment is by an academic called Dan Ariely, who wrote Predictably Irrational. And he's a behavioural economist, and there's a huge amount of research around this. We're not rational creatures, and I think that plays into the gender debate very strongly.
Great. We're not done yet. We'll be back with more myths in the next episode of In Her Shoes.